I've chosen to talk about a business book, but I've chosen a business book that I think is quite an anti-business business book. What do I mean by that? Anyone that's read a business book has probably noticed it does one of two things. It either has one idea and it tells you in every chapter the same idea in a slightly different way, but it's basically could be summarized in a blog, or it holds back its one idea, makes you read 12 chapters of anecdotes, stories, the personal experiences of the author before you get to the punchline. Those business books drive me mad. This business book I love because it's inspirational, it's actually practical, so it gives you tools and techniques to use, and it's actually like a manual. It's a useful thing that I use all the time in my work because I do a lot of work with organizations about how to change how they work, and this is kind of my Bible. So I'm going to preach to you lot a little bit about why this Bible I think is so interesting. I do need to apologize. I'm suffering with a hell of a cough and cold, so I sound horrific. I'm hoping we're going to get through 10 minutes without a coughing fit. If that does not happen, I'll start doing this via interpretive dance and you'll just all have to guess what the book's about. We'll give it a good crack. So, Brave New Work by Aaron Dignan. What's it all about? Well, it's looking at how the world of work isn't working and what we can do about it. So what does that mean? World of work, how organizations are structured, how we think about how work gets done, how we set strategies, how we divide up resources in a company. All of those things haven't fundamentally changed since the Industrial Revolution. And that's really the premise of the book, is to say, you could look at an organizational chart from 1920 and you couldn't tell if it was written yesterday or 100 years ago. If you looked at a car from 1920, you could probably tell it was not built yesterday. If you looked at a suit jacket, you could tell it was not built yesterday. If you looked at any kind of kitchen appliance, you could tell it was not built yesterday. Organizations and their fundamental ways of design and operation have not evolved in the way that the world has. So what his premise is there is a better way. There is a better way of thinking about and getting our work done. And he gives some really practical ways to do that. So I'll run you through some of those practical ways. To start off with though, I know this is a bit cheeky, I'm supposed to say 5 things. This is like a footnote of my first thing, okay? I'm just sneaking it in here and hoping Andy doesn't notice. First of all, just have a think about your own experience of work. So think back across your career, moments of frustration, moments where you've thought, why is this so hard? Why can't I get this done? Why does my colleague keep doing this thing? Have a think, then have a read on screen at some of the instructions that I've lifted out the book. And for those of you maybe on the move, I'll just read a couple out. So there's things like, insist on doing everything through channels. Never permit shortcuts to be taken to expedite a decision. Make speeches, talk frequently and at length. Always refer matters to committees for further study and consideration. Bring up irrelevant issues as frequently as possible. Haggle over precise wordings, etc., etc. You've probably seen some, if not all, of these things lived out in an organization. So you might be thinking, what is this list? Where does it come from? Is it a study of organizations and how they work? It's not. It's absolutely brilliant. It's taken from World War II. It was written in 1944 by a guy called William Donovan, who was in the United States. He was the director of strategic services. And William's job was to figure out, how do we sabotage our allies? How do we use people on the ground in countries to undermine and destabilize regimes? And he wrote a field manual. A field manual that is full of things you can do day to day to just make life hard, to make things slow down, your ally less successful. So this excerpt is from the section on day-to-day business. It's 9 things you can do to sabotage a business. Now, what's scary is when you read it, you see a huge number of these things happening and playing out in day-to-day organizations. So my first thing is, scarily, organization design looks a lot like self-sabotage. The ways that they are set up, designed to run, to operate, looks a lot like this manual. And that's mad. it's completely crazy, but it also makes a lot of sense when you look at the history. So a very, very short synopsis of what the book explains in the sort of setup phase. And I will say what this book does well is balance out. It's not 90% setup, 10% punchline. It's about 10% setup, 80% really useful practical tools, and then 10% what can you do next. But in that 10% setup phase, he talks a lot about how organizations were initially sort of industrialized during the Industrial Revolution. A guy called Frederick Taylor came in and was basically fascinated with the science of how people do work. So if you imagine people in factories, if everyone's got their own innovative way of making a cog in a machine, you're going to have a bunch of different cogs. So he was focused on coming up with the one best way to do each task in an organization, writing manuals and training everybody and making sure everyone just got stuff done in the same way in exchange for a fair wage. So that was almost the initial premise of work, of processes and procedures to get stuff done. And in a way, that hasn't changed a huge amount. We have systems, processes, policies that say this is how we do things here, stay in these lanes and get your work done. So Aaron Dignan, the author, talks about that being like an operating system of organizations. It's like the stuff on your laptop. It's kind of invisible. It hums along and helps things work, but it's actually built on a set of assumptions and a set of sort of ways of working that we don't often challenge. So my second thing that I took away from the book is that operating systems of a lot of organizations separate thinking from the doing. Thinking is done by managers. Managers set strategies. They think about where we should go as a team, what we should be doing. The laborers, the workers, the frontline do the doing. They often don't get the chance to do the thinking. They're told, no, this is how we do things. When I thought about this sort of operating systems, how do they play out? Dignan gives a really useful example that resonated for me with kind of getting my head around this. If you think about traffic and how traffic is managed, there's two different systems that we see in our day-to-day lives. System number one, think of the intersection, popular in the US, right? Where a road cuts across another road. That is controlled by traffic lights. Rules are sort of set in stone using the technology that tells people when and how to go, and it manages a whole range of scenarios through that system. The implicit operating system there is saying, let's not leave the thinking and the judgment of how we're going to get across this road up to people. Let's manage it. It's a complex scenario. Rules can help. Let's put in technology and processes so that people can just obey. System number one. System number two is the roundabout. There's no technology at play in a roundabout. There's a loose set of rules and principles that you look to the one direction, you join the flow of traffic, and people generally get across a roundabout. There's no rules, there's no technology that it has to be managed and maintained. And interestingly, the number of deaths and fatalities is much higher on intersections than it is on roundabouts. And the cost of running intersections is much higher than roundabouts. But when a power cut happens, the roundabout still works, the intersection falls apart. They're two different operating systems for managing the flow of traffic, but they're built on different assumptions. One says that the rules and the technology should be enforced so that people just obey. The second says, trust people's judgment. A whole range of scenarios will play out if we have some principles to follow. So they're operating systems, and they're very similar to kind of how we can think about operating systems in an organization. So if that's the setup phase, Dignan has said, well, work hasn't changed much. We fundamentally have an operating system built that doesn't necessarily empower people to think as well as do. What's the solution? So the third thing is that the bulk of his book is talking about a different lens to think about how organizations work. He says that 94% of problems in business are systems driven, only 6% are people driven. So what he's saying is we need to tinker and change the systems of organizations so that people can do their best work. So his organization, which is called The Ready, have worked with hundreds of different companies to look at how they work, and they've come up with this canvas. Now, everyone in my field loves a canvas, a tool, a framework. Here's another one, but actually it's useful, and I use it all the time with companies. And the reason I like it is because it cuts across any level of an organization. So you could sit down with an individual who's really not enjoying their job, and you could look at this and say, where is their tension? Where is it their friction for you? Is it in compensation? Are you just not getting paid fairly for the work you do? Is it purpose? You do not understand what the point of your role is. Or is it in meetings? Do you spend 40 hours a week sitting in pointless meetings? So you could have that conversation on a one-to-one level, on a team level, on a functional department level, or on a whole organization level. Chances are there's going to be tensions that happen on an individual level that are sort of amplified at an organizational level. But what the book does is it takes these 12 domains, so purpose, strategy, authority, which are slightly different to how we often diagnose and think about organizations. We typically go in with quite a functional view. Let's look at marketing, let's look at strategy, let's work out what's broken. And this looks more kind of cross-cutting at those enablers. So he does a chapter on each of these domains, and each chapter is structured around a bit of an overview. So what is it? A bit of a sort of set of thought starters to challenge the assumptions we all hold about things. Then it gets really practical. How can you take action? What questions could you be asking your team, yourself, a company you're working with to start to tinker and sort of challenge those things? And so it's sort of 12 rapid chapters that are super practical. So for anyone that works in this field, I couldn't recommend getting this book highly enough just to dig into those. They're really open about, here's some, tried and tested things, here's some watch outs, here's some stories from clients we've worked with. So really, really helpful. Now, the constraints of 5 things means I can't talk you through 12 domains because Andy would blow up if I attempted that. So I'm not going to go through each of them. Happy to chat about them if we have time at the end, if anyone wants to dig into them. You can find a really nice blog on Medium by The Ready, which has sort of an overview of this canvas, has an image of it, breaks down a few of the domains. So I'm happy to sort of chuck a link in the chat at the end if anyone wants to go and have a sort of the short version before committing to the full book. But really useful, practical way of doing things. So if the bulk of it is giving you this framework and this sort of set of questions to use to diagnose what's going on, you then go, well, okay, how do I get started? If I discover that my team or my organization's strategy is completely off, what am I going to do about it? Now, again, he sort of challenges the status quo here. So a typical consulting firm would come in and say, right, we'll do a transformation plan. Let's plan for the next 2 to 3 years, stick a load of people in it, build a long roadmap of activity that makes us all feel comfortable and like we've done something, and off we go. Now, Dignam points out that organizations are complex things, right? They're full of humans who are complex on their own. They're even more complex when you put them in a room together. And then there's the world within which the organization works, which is complex and changing. So pretending we know what's going to be important in 12 months is a fallacy. So instead, he promotes a more experimental approach where you start really small, you try some stuff out, and you scale up from there. So it's very sort of embedded in the culture of lean startup and design thinking and sort of those schools of thought. So my fourth thing is about his practical approach to getting started. He has this sort of mantra of start by starting. And he gives us sort of a 3-step process, which I just dropped a quick picture in of that sort of that 3-step looping process, he calls it. So step 1 is to sense sort of tensions. What he means by that is this language of tension is the gap between where you are and where you want to be. We typically think of tension as a negative word, but actually he says it's a space of possibility. It's where things could be different. There is potential. So tensions show you in an organization where something's not quite working. They've developed a set of tension cards you can see there, and you can buy them on the website for an extortionate amount of money. But he lists them all in the book as well, so you could just also go and get them from there. But some examples of some tension are things like our processes get in the way of work. Our processes get in the way of our work, or we reflect infrequently. or we don't know how to say no. So he's got something like 72 tension cards, and he sits with a team and gets them to filter them down to 7. What are the biggest tensions holding you back? Then he has this concept of proposing a practice. So a practice is what's something we could do that would be better, that would improve or tackle that tension. Again, in the spirit of capitalism, he's built a set of cards there that you can buy, also get them in the book, that enable you to get some experiments and practices built. So things like start by stopping a meeting, process, or habit that holds us back. So he uses a brilliant example of a strategy meeting that one client all finally admitted was a total waste of time. And they spent a few minutes working out how much it cost the business. With all the prep of the slides and the charts and the time of people in the meeting, it cost them about £3 million a year to run this one meeting, 1 hour a month, plus all that prep. They canned it the next day and they saved their business £3 million. That's a practice that, because they spotted a tension and had an honest conversation about it, helped them to evolve. So you spot those tensions, propose a practice or a different way of doing things, and then agree a time-bound experiment. So let's try something for a short period of time that feels safe to have a go and see if it improves. So in the spirit of learning, let's see what we get from it. So a really kind of agile way of doing things, but it's effective. You know, it stops you coming up with theories and sort of philosophies on slide decks and gets you into the trenches making the change. But he recognizes people come to him and say, that's all very well. You've made a change in the marketing team over here or in finance over here. We've got a whole organization to run. How do we scale that up? So the 5th thing is a very short summary of quite a long section, which I've tried to boil it down to kind of 4 things that he talks about how you scale this. The first thing is criticality, which I'm pretty sure is a word they made up. But essentially, it's kind of Malcolm Gladwell talks about the tipping point. So where you go past a point of no return. Criticality is when enough people in an organization have experienced and enjoy this new way of working that they can't imagine going back to the old way. It would feel like a step backwards. So criticality is where you've built that kind of groundswell of change. The second is continuity. So unlike a lot of consulting firms, they don't want to be around forever. They don't want to build dependency. So they talk about the people who've experienced the change become coaches for the next people or teams trying the change. And then you can almost build sort of communities of these coaches who share learnings, experiences, but also can feed back to sort of senior management or whatever on some of those changes that are happening. The third one deserves a talk in itself, not a bullet point, but psychological safety, which is, for those of you that aren't aware of the work Amy Edmondson did at Google back in 2012 now, she studied what helps teams thrive and came up with this concept of psychological safety based on the research that said teams that do well typically are good at sharing airtime, so everyone has an equal chance to talk, and they're good at understanding and empathizing with one another's feelings. So it's about creating an environment of support and nurture where people are then able to try stuff out, experiment, even fail, and not feel consequences negatively. Without that safety, he says, a lot of this kind of experiment-driven work can't happen. It just, people don't have the permission. So there's a lot of work to do, and he gives, again, some useful tips on how to get some of that built. It's not flipping a switch. It doesn't happen overnight, but it's the kind of softer stuff, the touchy-feely stuff that, when given the right attention, can create the huge change. And then finally, the one that if I had £1 for every time a client doesn't do this, I'd be a rich woman and not work anymore. But giving people space, time to do stuff properly, time to experiment, time to try. There's a kind of the classic business cartoon you might have seen of a load of people, cavemen, I think, rolling a wheelbarrow up a hill, and it's got a square wheel full of stuff, and a guy's going past them, one guy with a wheelbarrow with a round wheel. He's like, hey guys, you should look at this. And they're saying, no, sorry, we haven't got any time. We've got to get this done. And it's that classic idea of we're so busy doing what we're doing fast, we don't have the headspace to look at something that could improve things. So space, absolutely critical. So look, I've done a whistle-stop tour through a very nasally voice telling you about this book. There's a lot in there. I hope there's some useful nuggets. I'm really happy to talk about any of them at length, as you can probably tell. But a quick rundown. So organization design looks a lot like self-sabotage. It's built on some of the things that people tried to take out enemy states. Operating system of many organizations separates the thinking from the doing. If you take that away, I think you'll really start to notice that. A lot of my work is trying to bring those two things closer together. The operating system canvas offers a different lens to rethink how organizations are run. The practical bits, so start by finding those tensions, proposing practices and conducting experiments. And then finally, scale comes from four things: criticality, point of no return; continuity, you've started a sort of wildfire across people; psychological safety; and space. I will leave it there.
Oh, that's so awesome, Charlie. Thanks so much. Big round of applause for Charlie. Also getting through that without, I don't think there's a single cough. Charlie, congratulations on both fronts. And a final round of applause just for both our speakers today. That was absolutely fascinating. That wheelbarrow analogy at the end actually hurt me, Charlie. Oh Christ, I feel that one deep. I've been trudging up a hill with a wheelbarrow.